Does existence, as we find it, reconcile with the idea that it was created by a loving God? That, I think, is the nub of the question posed by atheists. Basically, their answer being that no, it doesn't. But I had an epiphany this week, and I think I've got this organised in my head, maybe, and come up with an idea for how this might actually be the case, all to shove into one video. Ambitious or what? I should add, this is not me saying I figured out proof that God exists. That's just not what we're doing here. But this whole Bible project is about me trying to figure out what I think, and then trying to refine and distill my understanding as the pennies drop, as it were, to try and sort of put it all together in a nice tidy package. So this is what I'm trying to do today, to put this all together in one go, to put to bed the atheist arguments. As I've said before, I don't think any of the atheist arguments actually work, but it's difficult to point to why, particularly in a sort of organised fashion. So my feeling is that all of the atheist arguments, even the better ones, or probably perhaps more so the better ones, boil down to saying that's not how I would do it if I were God. So it's that sort of arrogance problem that I've talked about before on many occasions. I quite like Alex O'Connor's formulation of this, because he's put that as something along the lines of, if there were a loving God, then we wouldn't expect to find the suffering of animals. And clearly he's taken that from all the noise that surrounds the problem of evil and suffering, distilled it down to the sharpest point it can possibly be, and then put that forward as the sort of pinnacle of the argument, as it were. But it still boils down to his saying that if he was God, that's not how he would set things up. There was a video about this. I was going to do a tangent a while ago. It was 25 Christians versus one atheist, with Alex O'Connor posing that exact question. I decided not to bother in the end, though, because as much as that is actually quite a difficult question to push back on, my feeling was that actually it entirely misses the point. My thinking was that the question should have been, is there any scenario that exists that could explain all this? And if the answer was no, then I guess Alex would sort of won that. But at the same time, on the grounds that humans can't possibly operate on the same level as God, all that would really prove is that we can't come up with what that answer is. So it's not particularly helpful in that respect. But I think actually the answer to the question is yes. And we can come up with a scenario that makes sense in human terms that could account for why the universe is the way it is. So my video for that would have ended up being very short, because I think the answer is that question could be answered in 5 seconds flat, basically along the lines of, well, here's a scenario that does fit. And then actually that question becomes sort of irrelevant, or rather perhaps not quite irrelevant, but it's a downstream question that's trying to grapple with and understand why suffering of animals or anyone might make some sense. But it's sort of offered up in that context as an argument for the non-existence of God. But I just don't think it's in that category of things. It is still saying, if I were God, I would set it up differently. But we're not God, so we can't necessarily come up with a situation or a scenario for what would actually explain it. When I did the best argument against God tangent ages and ages ago now, Graham Oppy, who was basically held as being one of the sort of top philosophers you've got to wrestle with if you're going to deal with atheist arguments, even he agreed that the existence of suffering is not disproof of the existence of God. So it is an interesting question, but as I say, it's a downstream question. And actually the first question should be, does God exist? And then if he does, then can you reconcile it? So Alex's question is kind of irrelevant. It's in that same category of questions like Bible contradictions or was Joshua a genocidal maniac? They're both later questions than does God exist? And they're basically saying, does it make sense if God exists that these things are true? But you haven't established first if God does exist. So by the end of this video, my plan is, ambitious or what, to lay out a scenario that I think makes sense in human terms for how God might have set things up the way they are, and therefore all of the atheist objections like suffering, evil, the rest of it, none of them disprove the existence of God. I would love to know if there's anything you think I've missed in this, but I think I've largely covered off certainly the big key objections, and some of them are done in very sort of small ways, covering off big ideas, but I think it is all in here. So let's go on and see what you think. So for the purposes of this thought experiment, let's imagine for a second that I am God. So I am no longer a post-Christmas, slightly chubby, balding, middle-aged man. I am not even a being, but I am being, consciousness and love all rolled into one. I am non-physical, I am outside of time, and it wouldn't even make sense to say that I've existed forever because I created the universe 13.8 billion years ago, and time only existed from that point. So the concept of forever is a human construction that doesn't actually apply to me. Easy to wrap your head around, huh? Okay, so the Bible in the book of Isaiah, which I'm currently reading or just finished reading, says that the reason humans were created is for the glory of God. So for the purposes of this, that is my motive for creating you. Now, initially, I've got to acknowledge that this is weird, because if a human said something like that, then it would make them unbearable at dinner parties. But I am not a human. I am being, love and consciousness all rolled into one, and therefore it's okay for me. I appreciate some people might not like that idea, so we can tackle that in another video if needs be. But for the purposes of the creator of the universe, I don't think that's necessarily a massively unreasonable thing to say. So I have now decided that what would tick the box for something that will glorify me is the creation of something I'm going to call people. But of course there's a catch, even for me. So if you listen to any of this out of context, I'm going to sound like a right old Donald. The first catch is that if I create you all with free will, unless I basically program you, then talk about being born with a silver spoon in your mouth. Just sit in the dark and think about that for 10 minutes, and I think you'll agree that that idea wouldn't make a lot of sense for growing decent people, as it were. In fact, I think that's probably a decent interpretation of the story of Adam and Eve, isn't it? You put human nature and free will in the Garden of Eden and it takes 30 seconds for them to screw it up. Now, you may say that human nature is a design flaw from that, but you have to admit that wrestling with those flaws, you all, because I'm God, I'm therefore flawless, shows that that's a great... You have to admit that it's an effective way to develop, grow and just become better people to the extent that it's done right. At some point I may do another tangent on the experience of suffering, because those of us without very much of it, admittedly me, we perhaps perceive it differently to people who actually are experiencing that suffering. Or at least I've certainly seen plenty of examples of people who are suffering, and not to make light of it, but it's not for them as we would perceive it when we're not suffering. But either way, I as God need to come up with some way to help grow you in character. But unfortunately now there's another catch. If I put you all in my new machine I'm going to create for growing character in humans, which I'm going to call the universe, if I say it's okay, there's going to be some affliction here, but on the other side of that, there's going to be some wonderful joy for all eternity, it's kind of asking for you basically all to turn around and just pretend you're being good, and then you'll get up to heaven having not actually made a choice or grown at all, and be a total pain in the arse. So you won't actually have chosen good over evil and grown. Or rather, you will technically have chosen between good and evil, but only to the same extent as someone with a gun to their head is choosing what the person with the gun wants rather than what they want themselves. It's not really a choice at all, is it? And I suppose while we're on this subject, I'm also going to have to find some way of hiding the doorway to the next bit behind something pretty hard to see through. So otherwise you're going to get all these wonderful clues and you're going to figure out what's going on. So the next catch there is I'm going to have to put you all into this furnace of affliction so that you can grow and develop and choose. And you can't know that I've done that in the sense that there's going to be better things afterwards. But at the same time, if you get no clue at all as to what the right thing to do is, then the whole thing's pointless anyway. So clearly I need to set this up with some clues for you, but without solid proof. This is quite a difficult thing. I could do with some help on this. Oh, Jesus Christ, this is going to be difficult. Good thing I'm God anyway. But yeah, so some initial thoughts on what could be decent clues. First one would be the universe. I mean, the fact it exists, if you actually stop and think about it, that's a pretty good clue, isn't it? Consciousness, this thing that no one's going to be able to explain because it's not actually based on the scientific thing. And that will also achieve sort of making you in my image, as it were. I shall put maths everywhere, which you can gradually uncover over time and see that there's all this order and the rest of it, and that obviously implies that a mind has set things up and it screams creator. DNA, that's another one. I'm actually going to literally write code across the foundation of your absolute existence. So, you can find that at some point and that should be a pretty good clue. I shall write my moral laws on your hearts. That's quite a good one, I think. So ultimately you're going to know what's right or wrong deep down inside. And when you do things that conflict with that, you're going to feel bad. And when you do things that are right, you're going to feel good. That will also handily take care of all the people who live on a desert island who don't know that I even exist or never heard that I exist. So that's quite a good one, I think. Next, I shall initially, I think, have to do some massive miraculous stuff so I can recruit some people to initially spread the word about me. I can give them some more detailed clues so they can spread this out. Handily, this will also build up a big list of records that will then be useful for the future, because I'm going to create the future as well. That's going to be a new thing. And then people in the future will be able to read what happened in the past and know from that what they're supposed to be doing. That should also solve the problem as well, I suppose, of them not having to do lots of miracle things later on that would be kind of a bit unsubtle when you're all running around with HD cameras in your pockets. I reckon I'll have to gently evolve my guidance and communication over time. As you evolve as a society, then we'll move things on in the same way as when you have children, you're not going to teach them to drive cars at 5 years old. So as you get better at things, we'll tweak things as we go. I think overall, therefore, the truth will ultimately be there for anyone who actually really tries to find it, but a perfectly balanced truth with evidence and guidance, but without certainty. So it'll be perfect for that balance between growth and choice. Okay, so we're now getting somewhere, but we still have a few problems, not least that if you're all running around with free will, which I need you to have so you can make that choice, some of you are going to be pure evil, at least from time to time. That's going to come with some built-in affliction, but unfortunately for everybody, this affliction is going to be a necessary part for how people are going to grow. There's that Beelzebub guy wandering around here somewhere as well, who's not going to like this creation idea at all, but he's not a particularly nice chap, so he'd make a perfect person to fill the role of a Satan, or the Satan, I should probably say. Also, I suppose, if I set this universe up so it's not obvious that I've created it and I don't have to intervene every 5 minutes, then it's going to be very complicated and some of the stuff in it is going to hurt you. I'm going to have to invent nuclear stuff to create light and heat for you, but that's going to throw off tons of radiation, so then I'm going to have to create electromagnetism to put a shield around the Earth, otherwise you'll never exist in the first place. I think a liquid core to the Earth should do that nicely, but then it is going to cause earthquakes and volcanoes, and some of that is going to hurt you. But again, we need some affliction that's going to be built in. That affliction and adversity, when it meets human nature as I'm going to create it, is either going to define you, destroy you, or help you grow to become better people. And which it is will be down to you. This universe thing is going to have to be like the most massive, complicated fish tank ever. And I'm going to have to make it huge as well, so I can put groups of people in different corners of it without the risk of you bumping into each other, because that will just freak people out. Clearly, a lot of you are going to hate me for this, but one day you will understand that affliction and adversity was really important part of the equation and worth it. I mean, at worst, 100 years of not very nice time for a lifetime, an eternity of joy. I think that's a reasonable trade-off, given as well that at some point, think about how I'm going to work out the problem between justice and salvation. I'm going to have to go down there at some point to take the worst punishment imaginable when I don't deserve it, because justice is important. Hopefully, therefore, most of you will realise that I'm not asking you to endure anything I'm not prepared to endure myself. Actually, I'm going to invent Viktor Frankl as well, so when he gets down there, he can write a book for you all about how you can turn suffering into growth. What other problems do we have? There's going to be inevitably some children are going to suffer and die, and that really sucks. I'm going to have to figure out what I do about that, something along the lines of like reincarnation or parallel universe or something, but I can't tell you what the answer to that is, otherwise it will be so obvious something's really going on, and even Dawkins and Hitchens will work that out, and then there goes free choice again. Okay, I think that's everything. Oh no, what am I going to do with the bad eggs who really just insist on making the terrible choices? Well, I can't force those people to come and have a relationship with me and be around me, so if they decide that they'd want to be away from that, then I shall respect their choice. Okay, back to being Rob again, which is easier than being God. I reckon that's a monster simplification, obviously, but I reckon that's a reasonable scenario that does actually explain anything. Again, I'm not saying that proves the existence of God, but I do think that puts into human terms how the idea of God creating something can make sense in human terms. And that, to be fair, is almost entirely based on the Old Testament only, because I've only read up to the book of Isaiah, so I haven't even finished the Old Testament. And there's enough in that to basically come up with a scenario like that. So we haven't even had to factor in Jesus or anything else yet, I suppose, other than the brief reference to dying for sins. Just to clarify there, I'm absolutely not making light of suffering. It's quite difficult to say that bit about the children. I fully appreciate that I have been probably dealt a more fortunate hand than most people, at least to this point in life, and I fully acknowledge that that is just not fair at all. But my point is that in this scenario, hopefully that shows a model of how life would be unfair and how that could still make sense. Basically, because if God didn't set up the universe that it would sort of run itself, then it would be obvious that something was going on. And again, we go back to that problem. We're making a choice, but basically with a gun to our head. Okay, I'm ready. Tell me in the comments whether you think I've missed anything there. Be very careful not to miss the point, because this is a subtle distinction between what we're talking about here and whether a donkey actually spoke. But if you can't show that this scenario is actually wrong, then by definition you're sort of conceding that figuring out if all that stuff I just said is vaguely true is worth doing. And if enough people watch this, then I shall never have to talk about the weather or how work's going ever again.